they're not using power well because they have a good understanding of power. They're using power well because they have a good character. Good characters use power well.
Welcome, everyone, to Reclamation, a beEmboldened initiative. I am Naomi, a member of the team here at BE, and we exist for those impacted by spiritual abuse by providing support for the prevention of victimization as well as revictimization. We desire to create a place where people can ask the hard questions, begin to heal, and begin to rebuild. Today, we're talking to Laura and Scot, both co-authors of their new book, Pivot, the priorities, practices, and powers that can transform your church into a Tov culture. If this sounds familiar, if their names sound familiar, they also co-wrote a Church Called Tov. And I think, gosh, was that a couple years ago now, you guys?
3 years ago, yeah.
Yeah. Excellent book. I hear about this book all the time. People love it when I refer them to this book. And so now book number 2 is out. If you're not as familiar with these two, I'll give you a brief introduction for each, and then we'll head right into our questions. So Laura is, again, the co-author of both of these books. She previously also co-authored a children's version of the Jesus Creed and wrote a teacher's guide to accompany that book. She's a graduate of Wheaton College. She's also a full-time primary school teacher. She resides in the suburbs of Chicago with her husband, Mark, and their 3 beagles. Dr. Scot McKnight is a world-renowned speaker, writer, professor, and equipper of the church. He is a recognized authority on the historical Jesus, early Christianity, and the New Testament. He's a professor of New Testament at Northern Seminary in Illinois. He's a sought-after speaker. He's been interviewed on several radio and television programs, as well as spoken at numerous local churches, conferences, colleges, and seminaries in the U.S. and around the world. Scot is also a member of the Society of Biblical Literature and the Society for New Testament Studies. And Laura, we also have to add that you are a speaker now too, because I saw you speak on stage. So we have to add that to your bio.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I'm a reluctant speaker, but I did just recently speak at the Restore conference here in Chicago.
Yes, and she did an excellent job. It was so great to get to hear you live.
Naomi, were you at Restore?
I was. Yes. Yeah. Yes, I was there, and beEmboldened was able to be a sponsor of it, which was really great. We got to meet so many incredible people.
I wish I got to meet you. I had no idea you were there.
Yes, I don't think we got to catch one another. But it was great to get to hear you. And Scot, I believe you were there last year, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, the last Restore conference I was there. And I was scheduled to be at this one, but she changed the dates, and I had already had a speaking engagement that date.
Well, fortunately, you had an excellent plan B available to you.
That's right.
I was the same.
I taught her everything she knows.
There you go.
Do you know Laura's my daughter?
Yeah. Oh, you're right. I know that, but anyone who's listening or watching might be wondering why the banter. Yes, Scot is Laura's father. And so there you have it. So he's able to say he taught her everything he knows. And it's funny. It's not arrogant. Well, with that, we're talking about their new book, and I want to put this out there right up front. There are so many different directions I could have gone with this conversation, where the book is so full of beneficial information for people, whether it's leadership or it's people who are looking for healthy leadership. I see it being of incredible value to both sides of that equation. So to narrow us down and give a conversation today where people can really track and maybe get deeper with a thread that you have going throughout the whole book, I decided to focus in more on character itself. So I have a couple questions kind of heading in that direction, but then we're going to kind of camp out and talk about the importance of character when we're assessing for a healthy environment. To get us started, early in your book, you directly spoke to the mission of the church. Would you please share your comparison between what the mission of the local church ought to be versus what missions you sometimes see instead?
We always have to wait with one another to figure out who's going to answer these questions. But that one sounds like one for me.
That's the theologian's question.
Okay. All right. Here's the big issue. Churches live most of the time by measuring success. So they see themselves, a church will see itself as successful if they measure up to what they think is important. And what happens with success in most churches is they measure it by the number of people who come to church and the amount of money that's coming into the church. So everything gets geared. Now, if you're a pastor of a church of 75 people and you're barely making budget, you might be spending your time trying to figure out how to get more people to come to church who can give money, or getting people to give more money who are there, or finding some rich people who can fund the place. And all of a sudden, then everything gets reshaped by that. Our contention is that a church should be measuring Christ-likeness, depends what term you want to use, measuring character, measuring spiritual formation, and even those categories, those expressions are very difficult to measure quantitatively. You can't take a test and say, aha, I'm Christ-like. This is discerned by people who have discerning skills about such a thing. So I think churches have tended to move in the direction of quantification, measuring success by numbers, rather than measuring and focusing on spiritual formation, Christ-likeness, and character development.
And I've been in jobs where the focus has been more on the income. I've been in for-profits. Not that it doesn't happen in nonprofits like you're talking about right now. It really does change the vision and mission. And that, of course, is going to change then how we're actually relating to people. I think it can change the genuineness of the interaction. It can change, we could start looking at people more of what they have to offer us instead of how we can serve them. Just curious, kind of your thoughts on what that then, the impact it then has.
Well, if you, I thought you were asking Laura a question. If you measure, let's say you start focusing on character, it's going to change preaching. It's going to change expectations. It's going to change who becomes elders. It's going to change who becomes pastors, leaders in the church. It's going to change what happens in small groups. It's going to change what happens in youth groups. It's going to change what happens to children's curriculum in the Sunday school classes. So everything is impacted by the basic vision. Now, churches that measure, let's just say they try to focus on how many people they can get to church on Sunday and how much money shows up in the plates. They it's not one thing or another. They're going to have Sunday school classes that focus on spiritual formation, etc. But the reshaping of everything, and Laura wrote about this when she told the story of, I can never remember the name of the church, but I know the pastors, Mike Lucan and Oak Hills, Mike Lucan and Kent Carlson. Everything changed at that church without anything changing. They were all there. They did the same thing, services, but they recalibrated everything, and it shifted everything in a new direction.
Well, and you talk about when you share in the book about what the mission should be, you then move into, measuring the fruit of the ministry. And I think you asked, like, is there fruit? But also, how is the fruit doing? Is the fruit rotten? And when we're talking about measuring this fruit and we're comparing to what we should focus on versus what's too often, hyper focused on, as you're talking about now, what would rotten fruit look like versus healthy fruit? Do you have an example that you'd be able to share, one of you or both of you?
Well, what comes to mind for me immediately, so I want to first of all preface this by saying sometimes you don't, as a layperson, like I am, you don't see it. And, we can testify that we have been fairly close to pastors and leaders and not know it because they're very good at hiding it from people they don't want to see it. But somebody somewhere knows it's there. It can look like power abuse. It can look like, for me, celebrity culture has a lot of rotten, toxic components to it. It can look like only important people can get close to the pastor. So I could keep going. Hopefully, those are good examples. But people have asked us this, like, what red flags should I look for? And I think some are very obvious and some are not. And the reality is that you can't always see it.
Laura,
but somebody knows it.
Yeah, yes, that's right. And Laura came up with the idea of the peach tree, and because she's got a bad peach tree in her backyard. But the thing about this, Naomi, is yes, people do ask us, what are the signs of a toxic leader in a toxic church culture? Well, I could say they're narcissists, and I could say that they're using fear to prop up their power. But you're not going to see that on Sunday morning on a platform. And if you don't get behind the scenes in closed door meetings, you will never see these things. But time and exposure, if you can get into a church culture and watch it operate, you'll discover the invisible drivers, motivators, machines that are at work in the church that actually have more influence than anything else. And in my opinion, one of the most common drivers of toxic churches is ambition for glory on the platform. And everything gets shaped by that, and nobody sees it and knows it because the platform is performed so well. So these people are good speakers. We know, Laura and I both know. I mean, we all know some people who are really, really effective from the platform, but are rotten to the core in some ways in character. And you don't find out about it by going to church on Sunday morning and then going out for coffee on when the service is over, or going out to lunch at Culver's when lunch is over. You're not going to see it that way. You have to be inside to find these things. And what we want to do is provide churches with a tool, we call it the Tov tool, to provoke and create the opportunity. In other words, we'll say it positively, an opportunity for people to answer questions that will lead to some honest conversations and transparency of some things that are going on in churches. One of the things that happened at my seminary was too much turnover. All right, too much turnover. Most people don't leave a job because of the job. They leave because of people. All right, so they leave because of their boss or their director. And if there's a lot of turnover, you need to be looking at who do these people answer to. And if most of them are answering to the same person, you probably have got the right thing fingered to take a look at. But you are not going to see that when they do their public speaking or when they are in the classroom. You're going to see it in other ways.
The more, I do have to say, the more we've been in this, I don't know what it's become for us, Dad, sort of a ministry. I feel I'm just struck that over and over again, back to character. I feel like character eventually catches up with you. In some way, somehow, it catches up, and you can, a church can try as hard as they want to suppress what happened, but eventually it catches up and somehow it leaks. And so it can be hard to see, but I've seen that over and over again, is that eventually it catches up.
Well, and I heard someone actually just speaking on this earlier today where they were in a position of leadership. And so they were very close to the senior pastor who was the concern in the situation. Oftentimes it is, but it's not exclusively. But as a senior pastor, this person was in close community with them, closely working beside them. And they were like, this is bad. And they finally got out after years and they left. But the response from the congregants, it's a smaller church, so everyone does know one another. The response from the congregants has been, well, yeah, but I haven't seen that. It's speaking to exactly what you had said, Scott, where they don't see it, right? Because it's different when you're working closely. And I think that's an important message for people to consider is just because you haven't seen it, if someone else has been in a different kind of relationship and they're saying, hey, this is a problem, we should really entertain what they're saying and consider it very carefully because it's very likely that they know something we don't. And unfortunately, what happens is people then stick around longer. And then the poor person who left gets more isolated. It's this whole downward spiral. It just gets messier. And so, we're not always going to see it all ourselves. And okay, who are we trusting to as we're making our decisions? I think that can be really tough for people to navigate.
And Naomi, one of the things we've learned is that let's just say that the senior pastor is abusive with power. Let's just make that the sin here that we're focusing on. That senior pastor will not abuse everybody with power. So there will be some people who think that person is wonderful. And I mean, I can say, I know stories like at our seminary, the faculty basically didn't experience this with an administrator, but other people did. So I could say, I never saw that. But when people began to speak up publicly, then you say, I believe that that's going on. Now, if one person has a complaint, it's a little bit more difficult because a single person's complaint is not the same as 12 people having the same complaint. So in the great book by Lisa Oakley and Justin Humphreys, they talk about trying to find a pattern of abuse. If you can find a pattern of abuse, you don't have a problem with evidence. When it's one person, it's more difficult. But that does not mean that there wasn't abuse of that one person just because there's not a pattern. It's not like we have to have 5 people before we can talk. No, that's not the case either. So it is difficult. Yeah.
It's also so damaging to victims when they're told, well, I haven't seen that, so that can't be true.
Yes.
And people need to be really, really careful about comments like that. It's really hurtful to the person that has been abused and mistreated. I'm thinking back to when my dad wrote a blog post, his initial blog post about Willow Creek, and he got a letter that said, well, I know Bill Hybels didn't do those things. I know him and he was too busy. And not to discount that person's experience. They knew Bill and they knew he was busy, but it doesn't mean that the stories are false. There's abusers are not always abusive.
Yeah.
They don't everybody.
That's right. That's the point.
Well, and honestly, I don't think they wouldn't get away with so much if they did do it with everybody. It's too obvious.
Yeah.
Right.
So you have this quote in your book that I really, really liked and I wholeheartedly agree with. And I'm wondering if you'd kind of elaborate on what you were saying in Pivot about this. So the quote is, power tied to lack of character leads to spiritual abuse. It was just so succinctly put. Just yes, absolutely. So would you talk a little bit more about that?
I saw Laura put this out on Twitter or something like that on social media the other day. But here's an issue. Some people would look at power as the most important thing. And if we can get power right, then culture will form in the proper direction. I don't believe that. I mean, if power is right, let's just say that you have a person who uses power very well, and they have power because let's say they're in a position of authority. They're not using power well because they have a good understanding of power. They're using power well because they have a good character. Good characters use power well because they're not going to abuse because they have character. I mean, I put it this way. I grew up in a locker room, basically. My father was a high school coach. If you go to a baseball game and everybody's booing the referee, we got a problem here because a good referee, a good umpire in a baseball game is unnoticed because they do their job so well. Isn't that right? If you're complaining about, you notice everything. Well, when you go to other games, let's say you go to a basketball game and someone says, "What'd you think of the officiating?" And you say, "I didn't even notice." That's the best compliment you can give to a referee. All right. So now I'll use this with power. You won't notice people who use power well because you don't notice that they're using power. All of a sudden, it just seems things are flowing well. But when you're wondering, is that an abuse of power? You probably have something worth thinking about. So I believe that character is far more important than power. I know someone who's writing about power, and they don't think culture and character is as important as power, but I just think that's completely mistaken. And it will lead to a false perception of the significance of power. I would put it this way. If you're spending all your time talking about power, you probably got power problems. Right? I mean, the only churches that I know, the only institutions that are carping and griping about power is because there's power problems. And it might be that other people want to be in charge and they're not in charge. So.
Right. Laura, anything you would add to that?
No, I'm just thinking more and more, I've had the privilege of talking to educators. It's one of my favorites when Tov and education converge for me. And I feel the same way about education as I do about ministry, about any profession. It's about who we are. It's about who we are as people that makes us most effective. And who you are as a person determines how you use the power you have. And all of us have power. I have power in my school, on my team, with the parents in my classes, with the parents of the children in my class, with the children themselves. And like I said, the more we've done this and the more time we've spent talking to people, I really believe we're as effective as our character allows us to be.
I absolutely agree. Yeah, the seminary that I attended, I've seen them take more of a turn where they're focusing so much more on character development alongside, the academic aspect that of course is necessary for a seminary education. And I have so much respect for their embracing of this because I think the result is going to be leaders that are really heading in that servant leadership direction that Christ has actually shown us versus, yeah, I'm going to come out and I'm going to build a platform and I'm going to be known and I'm going to, whatever the goals may be, and having the pressure of, okay, what does success look like? And I think we're battling our culture, kind of big picture culture in the United States. When we talk about that, and it definitely is seeped into the churches where, okay, sex or success is just defined by like you had mentioned earlier, Scott, like the numbers, how many people are coming in the door, how much money is coming in. And no, that isn't the fruit that we're measuring. So it all connects. Like you're saying, I have a hard time imagining, I don't know who's writing the book about power, and I don't need to know right now, but I have a hard time going in that direction too, of thinking power is the biggest issue. I would see that character is going to drive the use of power, like you're saying. And that's really the core, that would come first. And if we're looking at that, and we see, when we think about New Testament, Scott, if we can pull in your New Testament scholar aspect here, we've got a lot of character statements in the New Testament and the importance of character.
Yeah. Good fruit grows on good trees. That's called virtue ethics.
Mm-hmm.
Be a good tree. Yeah. Nobody's perfect. Nobody's going to be, there aren't very many people like Mr. Rogers. He's the best. But most people are aware of when they're exceeding their limits.
Yeah. So as we're talking about character, I can imagine people who are listening and wondering, okay, well, how would I put roots to this, in their personal lives, as well as if, say, they're either going into a church and they're trying to assess for character, or if you're on a pastor search team and you're like, okay, how am I assessing character of somebody? So I want to touch on both of those. So first, how does someone develop their own character? How does that happen?
All right. Now, this is an interesting part about this, of writing this book for Laura and me. I can't, and we've told in other podcasts, I've said this because it's so much a part of the experience. Over and over, I said to Laura, we could begin this book with any chapter. These chapters are a network of connections. All right. So how do you go about developing character? I think that Laura could talk about, I would say it begins with examples. And so, Laura has written a little bit about this in the book. So I'll pass this one on to her.
It's such a big question. I don't even know where to start. So I know you're suggesting emulation, but I don't know. I keep going back to the Oak Hill story. I wrote about it in the book. It's deeply impactful, not only for me, but when Julie Roys invited me to speak at the conference, and we were talking about what I would include in my talk, and I told her that story, she said, "You have to tell that story." And I think it has such a good connection to character development. And it was all, for me, that story is all about, there were those two pastors, they felt a stirring in their spirit. They knew God was telling them the layout of our church, the way that it's set up as a mega church, is actually working against the invitation of Christ to transform lives. And they listened to what the Spirit was telling them. And not only did they listen, they surrendered to it and followed. And again, like my dad said, the book could have started anywhere, but isn't that really where transformation of character begins? Is listening to the Spirit, surrendering, and following where He leads. And that connects to the grace chapter. But for me, that's the beginning of, and the most important part of having good character and developing.
Yeah. And I would say that we do not know character. Our characters are formed in relationship with people, right? With our parents, with our siblings, with those we love. That's where character comes from. And if you hang out with Mr. Rogers, you're going to end up being a better person than if you hang out with, I don't know, We won't mention names. Okay.
I just pulled that out of my
Who'd
hat.
you say?
I said Hugh Hefner. I don't know.
There you go.
Okay. There you go.
You
No problem.
can
All right.
that out if you need.
So character
I mean,
is
he's
formed.
dead now, but
Character is formed in relationship with other people because we rub off on one another, and communities shape us because they have the power to approve us and not approve us, even when we are unaware that this is going on. That's what happens in a culture of a church, is it has the power to make you comfortable or uncomfortable. It tells you whether you belong or don't belong. It has the power to make you the kind of person that fits in that culture. So character is formed that way, but character is also shaped by an individual's personality. So I was talking with someone the other day, and I thought they were a really wonderful person, but I realized that I thought this guy is a salesman. And salespeople have the capacity to convince you that you're really good. And so I draw up and I go, I'm not sure. I think you're just full of hot gas. And so I need to be proven with business type people who are salespeople that they really have character. But there's other people that you hang around who, now we had some people who worked at our church for a while, Bill and Linda Richardson, who are Anglican priests, both of them. And they were just absolutely wonderful people. And I think when they were in the room, there was a change of tone because of who they were. So all these things impact character, but it is partly shaped by personality. It's shaped by decisions. It's shaped by experiences. And over time, let's say our deepest character is formed into who we are. And, your character flaws in many ways are probably never going to entirely disappear. And your character strengths are probably always going to be there, and sometimes when you need them, they're not there. So that's the nature of a fallen human being. And God's Spirit can transform us, but we all know the experience of working with people over time, realizing I was working with a person who actually is involved in spiritual formation stuff. And she said to me, it's just so discouraging to me to see so many Christian leaders with such bad character. Why are people who are always reading the Bible so mean-spirited to their staff? What's going on here? So I think we have to live with some of that, Naomi. That's part of being human in our fallen world. But character is a complicated dimension of our experience. It's who we are, but it takes time for it to develop, and it forms in relationship with other people, good examples, and in the context of our community.
I think when we value it too, it changes our perception of tough stuff that we go through. May I offer that? Like, if I think about, going through something difficult, trying to navigate, and I don't necessarily mean like, yes, suffering, of course, but even just navigating maybe a tough conversation with somebody, or, there's maybe a falling out, and okay, how am I going to handle this in a Christ-like way? How am I navigating this? I think when we value character and we're not only focused on the outcome, but hey, I want to go about this well. I think there's something to just that the acknowledgement that character matters, because again, it's just so overlooked too oftentimes in our culture. Recognizing, yes, character matters and I value character development. That's something I care about. And so when I'm going through difficult things, I'm not just wanting it to be over with. I'm not just wanting to kind of fake it till I make it. I'm wanting to like genuinely figure it out. I'm wanting to genuinely be changed through it. I'm wanting to, does that make sense?
Yeah.
Like how we approach it.
My therapist calls it post-traumatic growth.
There you go.
Where it's like character thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I had a difficult situation not too long ago where I had to talk to a person about some stuff going on. And I sat on it for quite a while, prayed about it, and wanted someone to be present with me. So we did that. And I felt like I was able to be clear and direct and point out the issues. And the person's response was basically total denial, almost a form of gaslighting.
Wow.
And I felt pretty good about it. I thought, I did my part. I said what I needed to say. It was only right. I felt it was right. And that person just basically told me I was totally wrong. I went, okay, that's the way we're going to look at it. That's all right. I've done my part. And now we're just going to have to see what, let's say, God's Spirit's going to do, see what happens.
Yeah. Such a healthy response of, yeah, this is my part, and then that's their part. This is what I can do, and I don't have any power over that. Yeah. Well, as we're wrapping up today, and I really want to ask you this question as our final one. So again, when we're talking about individual character development, when we're talking about people who have been hurt and they're going out and they're saying, okay, I'm going to consider another church. I'm trying to assess the character as I walk into this new environment. People who maybe have had to let go of someone on the team and they're looking for someone new. There is this exhausted saying, in my opinion, of nobody is perfect or you're not going to find a perfect church. How do you know? I'm trying to say that I'm kind of making a face because it makes me gag a little bit because I'm like, well, no, duh, we know that. But there's a huge gap between imperfection and abuse. Okay. We got a lot of room in between there. And so I find it to be a very dismissive statement. But the point I know they're trying to make is that, well, basically what is reasonable? And so that's my last question to you. When we think about nobody's perfect, there isn't going to be a perfect church. How does someone know what expectations of another are reasonable?
Theologian.
Okay. This is a really interesting
You've got
question.
the book out.
Well, actually, I got my notes out. Here's what I would say. It's time to leave when your presence in that group is triggering of, let's say, traumatized experience. So if you're let's just say you're in a church, an institution, and being there, being with these other people is triggering for you, then you're not in a position to be functioning as you're called to function with that group of people. If there's people on the platform you don't like, get over it. That's part of it. Part of life. We're not going to like everybody. But if it really is re-traumatizing for you to be in their presence, then you're not in a position to engage them in a relationship.
You are the first scholar I have ever heard say that. And I'm not saying that as a hit against all of the other ones. I've had incredible conversations with wonderful people that I have the utmost respect for. But it can be tough to explain that not everyone can get back into it right away because they're not actually able to. And there's very real reasons for that. And at beEmboldened, we come alongside people and in hopes that they'll be able to get back there. They'll be able to move forward and be part of a community again and attend church and all of these really blessed things that we are called, to be a part of. And yet they can't for a while. And the way you just put that was so beautifully said. And I appreciate it so much. And I know that that comment is really going to bless people to hear because people can feel like they're failing and like there's really something wrong with them versus no, something's been done to them. And they're walking back into an environment that looks really darn similar. And so it can be really tough to even trust themselves to know what's different or what's the same, to trust their communication with the Lord to recognize what's different, what's the same. And so it takes time to get their feet under them to be able to go in to even say, okay, I'm going to assess, I'm going to try to be a part of this again. And so thank you so much for what you said. Kind of makes me want to cry a little bit. I just really appreciate it. And I know that others are really going to appreciate it.